too about the experience. So I mentioned my friend Roger and what a powerful impact that had on me as a boy, a friend that as young people growing up together, we could have some really honest discussions with one another. But a couple other things that really impacted me. My father moved to Minnesota before my senior year of college, and I came and spent that summer out here. I had never grown up here. It was a great summer to be with my grandparents and cousins and aunts and uncles. So when I finished school, I moved here. And my pastor in Massachusetts called me and told me about a thing called the Soul Liberation Festival at some church called Park Ave United Methodist. And so I went to, my dad and I went to visit. Tony Campolo was speaking, who had a big impact on my life when he spoke at Gordon College. So he spoke the first night, and I said to my dad, can we come tomorrow night? This was great. And the second night was John Perkins. And the third night was, may rest in peace, Tom Skinner. And I said, Dad, we got to check this church out on Sunday. And Soul Liberation Festival is a big outdoor festival for a week with gospel music and preaching. And so we went there, and it's one of those moments, I was 21, 22 years old, where I remember where I was sitting, I remember what I was wearing. I can close my eyes and see everybody sitting in the room. And there was a choir of about 150 people up behind the pulpit, black, white, a few Latinos from 12 years old to 80, and I began to cry. My dad looked at me and said, "Are you okay, David?" I said, "Dad, look at this room. This is what heaven's going to be like." And that church became my home church with a capital H for the next 20 years. And the people in that church, where they were struggling to live out the promise of reconciliation, with all its messiness and all its difficulties, shaped a big part of who I am. And that's the church that called me into ministry and called me to go on and get my higher education degrees. But that had a huge impact on me, living in South Minneapolis and being part of the church. And the other thing was, I went to Zimbabwe on a study abroad program. I didn't even want to go. My teacher signed me up when I was in grad school at Luther, signed me up and gave me a scholarship, and I lived in an all-black township. So then I had long black blonde hair down the middle of my back, so I really stood out. I'd stand in the line to go to Kuwadzana, and people would say, "Excuse me, sir, do you know where you're going?" I'd say, "Yeah, Kuwadzana." And I go, "White people don't go to Kuwadzana." So that had a huge impact on me, to live in a small home with 13 people, 4 bedrooms, to share bread with 2 of my African brothers, to experience their life for about 6 months. Had a huge impact on beginning to unpack my identity in a different way, and to have, in an international context, some really important discussions with people. So I think mentors are really important, friendships are really important, and those kind of experiences that move you to a place where you're the other begin to cause you to reflect on yourself. In fact, I think study abroad is not always so much what you learn about others, but what you learn about yourself.
I want to answer this question a little bit for myself. My own understanding about that, I'm a white male, started really, well, I grew up in rural Iowa during the 1980s. And if you know anything about rural Iowa in the 80s, it was the farming crisis. And it was a really violent time for a lot of farm families. And so I grew up understanding that there is such a thing as oppression. And there are privileged and people who are experiencing oppression. I saw the violence of farms ripped away from farm families, and the violence that created within the family, suicide. And so I grew up understanding that. So that's part of, for me, when I started to think about these systems of privilege and power, I have a context for that. Also, lived experience has been a big part of my own journey in college. I lived in the Phillips neighborhood, which is a very diverse community, particularly compared to central Iowa. I grew up in rural Iowa, and it was 99% white. So then moving to the Phillips community, it dislocated me from that context and exposed me to a lot of other cultures and experiences. In seminary, I started reading liberation theologians. And liberation theologians, and I actually stumbled across them. This is an important thing here. I wasn't introduced to them, I found them. So my teachers weren't saying, "Hey, here's what you should be reading." I stumbled across these liberation theologians. And they were telling me that fundamental to the scriptures is an idea that God sees and God privileges and God works on margins. That's where God's activity's at. And these liberation theologians were inviting me into a way of viewing the world from the margins, which radically shifted my perspective, because whiteness really is saying you view the world from the center, from the normative, whatever that cultural normative is. So that was another important shift for me. And then also, currently, we live in North Minneapolis, predominantly African-American community. And for me, living in that context day in and day out has made me need to think about my whiteness on a regular basis. It's not just a class that I took or just a book that I read, but I remember driving from my work at the time was at North Heights Lutheran Church up the street here, and I was driving from North Heights to home in North, and I got off the freeway, got onto Broadway, and I started to think about myself as being white. Like, I haven't thought about being white. Why am I thinking about being white? What I realized was, well, I'm the numeric minority in this community. And that made me reflect on my whiteness in a way, on an ongoing basis, which has been really, really, really helpful for me. Because too much of my world, it's easy for me to opt out of the conversation. I remember sitting on Robin Bell's porch one day. Robin Bell was a neighbor of mine. He's an African-American professor, actually at Northwestern. And Robin and I started the conversation, and Robin very directly reminded me, Tannen, every day I get up, I think about being black. And I was like, yeah, Robin, I only think about being white when I kind of initiate the conversation or the conversation comes my way, but that's very rare. And it just reminded me once again of how different our lived experiences are. So for me, living in that context has been important. And then also mentors. This last 8 years of my life, Leon Rodriguez has been a mentor of mine, a person that we've been able to work together. But Leon, he grew up in South Africa, was a part of the anti-apartheid movement, so he's a very different lived experiences than me. And I got to meet Leon in a place where he had a position of power. He was a chief diversity officer here at Bethel, and I was an associate campus pastor. So I was basically entry-level staff, and Leon was a director, of the institution, upper administration. Leon had a lot of more wisdom than I had. And that power difference in that mentorship was really, really helpful for me. Because I couldn't marginalize Leon's voice like I could maybe a peer of mine, or someone who maybe did not have the same educational level that I had. So having a mentor for me that was, that had that power and that knowledge was really, really powerful for me to dislocate me and make me think about things that I normally would not think about. There's a few questions that are coming our way. Yeah, go, Alex.
Maybe. I'm going to add something to that. I think the idea of having personal connection is big, but you have to be aware as a white person that you have power. Just by being white, you have the power. So there's a power dynamic going on. And like you said, having a peer is one thing, but oftentimes we don't realize that power is there, and the other person is aware of the power difference and we're not. And I think of, with international students in college, and we're being equal, or people who were upperclassmen when I was an underclassman, and just thinking about, okay, these people have a higher status, and they're people of color, and I can listen to them. And having a mentoring idea, I think, is important, because you want to have a person you can know well enough, you can have the conversations with, and you also want a person to have either equal or upper power on you, so you do listen to them. And that would be a place for you guys to start if you're not ready to go to Zimbabwe. To start with making a personal connection with a person of color, that you respect that person and be humble with that person, that you are learning from them. And if you have that power difference, try and minimize it or be very aware of your power difference. So that's what I have to say.
We're getting a few questions around some definitions. So I'm going to throw a few words out. I want us to try to define those words. So a few of the words that I'm getting some questions about. One is, what is white privilege? What is colorblindness? And what is white supremacy? Like those three words, colorblindness, white privilege, and white supremacy. Who'd want to give some definitions or try to explain those terms? We as white people
people have to understand that every institution in our country was set up to legitimate and perpetuate white male privilege. You can call it white privilege, you can call it white power, you can call it white supremacy. It's all racism. We're talking about universities, seminaries, banks, the government, and this is an unjust system. And the question is, as followers of Jesus, what, if anything, are we going to do to change the system? Because if you think that you're colorblind or you're not a racist because you have a black friend, I'm here to tell you tonight, that's not enough.
Well, I'm going to ask a follow-up question. Why is that not enough? Why is it not enough to have a black friend?
My first book on evangelicals, race, and American politics, Jesus and Justice, says that out of our evangelical tradition, we emphasize individuals. Born-again individualism, like Luther's theology of the punctiliar justification event in our individual reception by faith of God's grace. And then if there's going to be any reconciliation, it's going to be through an interpersonal relationship. And we can be friends, but what I'm arguing is, what if it was a revolutionary friendship where we had a common eschatological